Welcome to part 5. We are going to discuss food defense that falls under clause 2.5.3 of the additional requirements. Clause 2.5.3 discusses food defense. So in this part 5 of the series, we are going to be outlining the requirements for food defense within the FSSC 22000 framework. This additional requirement ensures the protection of food products from intentional contamination or adulteration introduced for the purposes of causing harm. What is it that we are going to discuss? We are going to firstly look at the threat assessment as per clause 2.5.3.1. We're then going to discuss the food defense plan as per the clause 2.5.3.2. I will take you then through some of the documents that you could use, some of them that we have at ASC, and thereafter the last part we are going to look at the frequently asked questions and the audit tips based on the audits that we have had. Right, so let's look at the first requirement under 2.5.3.1, which relates to a threat assessment and is applicable to all food chain categories. According to this requirement, the organization shall conduct and document the food defense threat assessment based on a defined methodology to identify and evaluate potential threats linked to the processes and products within the scope of the organization, and also develop and implement appropriate mitigation measures for significant threats. Right, so let's firstly look at the term that is food defense. What is food defense? So basically, this refers to the measures and strategies that would be or one would implement to protect food products from intentional contamination or tampering that would be perpetrated or done by people who intend to cause harm. This includes safeguarding against threats such as sabotage, terrorism, or criminal acts that could compromise food safety and health. So the key word here is intentional contamination that is motivated by malice, ideology, or the intention to cause harm. Then when we are speaking about the threat assessment, we are looking at assessing what are the potential threats and vulnerabilities within the food supply chain that could be posed by these aggressors. So the perpetrators would be referred to as aggressors. So we assess the vulnerable areas. We look at the probability of those threats occurring, and also if they do occur, what would be the impact to the consumer, to food safety, and then we put in the action plan. So basically, we identify potential threats, we evaluate the vulnerabilities, we analyze the impact, we assess the likelihood, we prioritize the threats that are posing a greater risk, and also then develop mitigation strategies to make sure that they are brought under control. The examples of potential threats include malicious contamination, which could be due to physical contamination, biological contamination, radioactive materials. It could include perhaps somebody using allergens, knowing exactly that the food is declared as allergen free. It could include cybercrime. It could include espionage. It could include extortion, and many other examples. So these would be the examples of potential threats. Obviously, we would look at the different areas where these threats could easily be done, or where the areas that are most vulnerable to these threats, and also the opportunities for aggressors to perform these threats. What are the examples of mitigation measures? So here we can look at physical controls or physical mitigation measures, where you have got maybe boundary fence, boundary walls around your facility. You have got doors to prevent anyone from accessing areas that are sensitive. It could include perhaps also lock and key measures. It could include self-closing doors. It could include, anything that will physically prevent somebody from accessing a sensitive area. It could also include procedural strategies or procedural measures where you have a procedure that when there is a visitor visiting the plant, they must always be accompanied by somebody from the plant. They are not allowed to go on their own. It could include training your staff on these procedures and ensuring that people who are coming from the outside, it could be suppliers, it could be contractors, or it could be visitors, they are given their own PPE so that you can easily distinguish a visitor from a person who's employed by the site. Other procedures could include the offloading procedures. What is it that the person who is at receiving must do when they are receiving a product from a supplier? What is it that a person must do when they load a product and it goes to the customer? It could include procedures on ensuring that the packaging is tamper-proof, whatever that you would consider as necessary as the organization. Other mitigation measures could include managerial measures, could include HR measures where employment, before somebody is employed, there is some procedures that they would have to go through, or there are some steps that they would need to go through before they're employed, including maybe background screening, maybe certain assessments, perhaps psychological assessments to determine if there are any issues that could negatively affect the safety of food in whichever way. So there are many mitigation measures that one could consider. Security measures, making sure that there are CCTVs throughout the facility. It could include perhaps making sure that the facility at night, there is security that roams around the facility. So a mitigation measure would be anything that would implement to ensure that the threat that you have identified does not actually get realized. So the aggressor finds it very difficult for them to perform that particular threat. And if it's a significant threat, like for example, a threat that we have defined as a critical control point where there is an open area, making an example, perhaps we have got a milk processing facility or a cheese processing facility. We would then identify perhaps the cheese vat as an area where there could be a significant threat of malicious contamination with either biological compounds, physical compounds, or maybe radioactive materials, and we have identified that area as a significant area of concern, where the significant threats that we see in that area could be malicious contamination through these measures that I've spoken about, either biological, chemical, or radioactive or physical. And then what will be done then is, what is the threat and what is the likelihood and the likelihood and severity of that particular threat in that area. Then you would put in control measures, because you have defined that area as an area of concern, and generally that will be your CCP, because of the potential impact it could have to the consumer. Perhaps whatever that you have identified will not be detected, and there is no other step where you can detect that something has gone wrong in that step, and therefore that will become a significant area of concern where all the controls must be put in place to ensure that that threat is either eliminated or prevented altogether, so that it does not create an opportunity for the aggressor to perform that particular threat. So that would be then the measures that one would then implement for that specific area. Right, so let's look at what we would regard as a threat assessment. So you can see here on this template that we have for our toolkit that we have actually identified the different types of threats that could exist within this organization. And then once we have done that, we look at the possible aggressors who actually will be the perpetrator and also who would be the responsible to mitigating that risk. For example, here we have got property boundaries, and these are the threats that we have considered. For example, there is a possibility that there could be theft. There may be a possibility of malicious contamination for whatever reason. Perhaps we have got brine tanks that are lined along the fence, and maybe somebody could get easy access to those tanks. And then the people who would perpetrate this would possibly be the professional criminal, and it could happen that there would be the opportunist, and then also the disgruntled individual. The risk owner perhaps is the security manager who will be responsible for that. Thereafter, we would have to then do the risk profile of this particular threat that we have identified, which would be malicious contamination and theft, and look at what is the probability of this happening, and if it does happen, what would be the severity, and then the risk rating. We base this obviously on our risk register, on our matrix that we have, where we define the different types of threats that could be posed by this particular area, or this area is exposed to, and it could be posed by these aggressors. And thereafter, we will have the actions trying to address this particular risk that we would have identified and is inherent to this area. And this risk is based on what is the inherent risk without actually having any controls. Then once we have got controls, then we go on and do a thorough assessment again, looking at the control measures as well as taking it through a decision tree. So this is how you will do a threat assessment. But fundamentally, you look at the different types of threats that could be present in that area, identify who is the aggressor, and then take it through a risk assessment, and thereafter determining what are the controls that you need to implement. Then clause 2.5.3.2 talks about the food defense plan. According to this requirement, the organization shall have a documented food defense plan based on the threat assessment, specifying the mitigation measures and verification procedures that the organization would implement. This is also applicable to all food chain categories. There are certain questions that one would ask themselves. For example, what is actually a food defense plan? And also the examples of verification procedures in relation to food defense. So basically, a food defense plan, that is an overall assessment that you have done, that you have put in place as an organization, having taken into account the threats that could potentially affect your organization, looking at the different areas of which you would be affected, and also the possible aggressors that would be the perpetrators of those specific threats that you would have identified. Then you'd have actions that you would have implemented to ensure that you try to mitigate those threats. So there will be actions, control measures, and mitigation measures. So once you have done all that and have formulated a mitigation strategy that speaks to the threats, including the risk profile of each one of those threats, we will then consider that a food defense plan, which we will then guide the organization how to mitigate and ensure that those plans do not actually affect or do not end up affecting their organization. So the entire system of your food defense will then be considered a plan, because that will be a way forward that will tell, or that will inform the organization, whoever that is involved, including the food defense team as well as the employees within the organization, what is it that they would need to do to prevent possible threats from affecting the organization. Right, so we have already explored what is a food defense plan, but another person may ask, what is TESAP? What does it mean? So basically, TESAP stands for Threat Assessment and Critical Control Points. It is a systematic approach used in food defense to identify and assess potential threats to food products, including intentional contamination or tampering, obviously motivated by malice, where somebody is up to no good, wants to cause harm. The TESAP process involves identifying threats where one would recognize potential threats that could harm the consumers or the food supply. It also involves assessing risk where you evaluate the likelihood and impact of these threats to the food supply or to the consumer. It also looks at implementing the necessary controls to mitigate identified risk and protect food products from these risks. It also then looks at monitoring and review, where you have got to continuously monitor the effectiveness of the controls and update the assessments as necessary. So TESAP, in other words, is a very important to ensure food safety and protect consumers from deliberate harm. Another question that we often find or people ask is, what would one consider as examples of verification procedures in relation to food defense? So here we are looking at things like audits and inspections, where one would regularly schedule internal and external audits to assess compliance with food defense plans and procedures, where we look at assessing the effectiveness of training programs to determine whether employees understand the food defense practices and protocols. We look at conducting periodic reviews of the facility and processes to identify any new vulnerabilities or changes in the risk profile of whatever threats that we have identified. We look at testing response plans, where we would conduct drills or simulations to test the effectiveness of response plans in case of a food defense incident. We would also consider supplier verification, where we evaluate suppliers or contractors to determine whether they've got adequate food defense measures in place and that they comply with the safety standards. Then also reviewing of incidents reports, where we would analyze any incidents or near misses to identify trends and improve food defense strategies to ensure that we maintain a robust food defense system and obviously enhance the overall food safety throughout the supply chain, and most importantly, the organization of which the food is being prepared, or whatever organization in the supply chain. Right. We have looked at then the threat assessment, then the food defense plan as a whole. You are taking account all these threats that you've identified. You take it through a decision tree, looking at the risk profile, and obviously you are going to follow the decision tree that has been provided for you. I think it's on the side. This is the one that you'd use. And once you've determined the risk profile, you then determine whether that is a PRP, can be controlled at a PRP level. Obviously, this will be mentioned on this decision tree. Is it controlled at CCP? Is it controlled at, or is it what we call a vulnerable threat point that we would need to control? Then you look at what are the mitigation strategies that you will implement to ensure that this risk is properly controlled. It could happen that for the property boundaries, it is a physical management strategy, and also perhaps procedural, to say that if a person comes maybe from the outside, this is what they would need to do. So this is basically what you follow as a plan. And you combine this threat assessment, you look at the team, the threat, the TESAP info, the risk register, the metrics, sensitive areas, and everything that you have done. So every one of these tabs that you have done here, done the threat assessment, looked at the risk register, your procedures, and everything that is around food defense, we would then refer to that as a food defense plan. In terms of the food defense plan, the most important thing here is to plan on what is it that you are going to do to mitigate the risk, and what could be perhaps the short-term mitigation, the the medium term, and also the long term, the responsibility, and also when is it that you are going to review to determine whether that risk profile or the risk that you have identified has been brought under control. So it is crucial that when we have got a food defense plan, there are time frames that are allocated to each and every plan that you have come up with, and there's a person who's responsible for ensuring that whatever strategy that you have reviewed or that you want to implement is actually being implemented, including the time scales and the target date. Then, of course, you would generally review that whenever there is a breach, and also if there isn't any breach or everything goes according to plan, on annual basis you review if it's still applicable, is it still effective enough to ensure that whatever threats that we've identified are under control. So that's how we would then formulate a comprehensive food defense plan. Another important thing perhaps that I have not mentioned is the procedures, making sure that there are procedures in place and making sure that every person who is part of the food defense team has received the necessary training and they understand the principles of food defense, and also what is actually the methodology that the organization is using for food defense, and additionally training your staff on food defense as well as site security. Right, so further on 2.5.3.2b, we are still discussing the food defense plan. Here, the requirement is that the food defense plan shall be implemented and supported by the organization's food safety management system. I have showed in the next slide what could be the documents that one could use, but basically what is required here is that there is integration of the food defense plan with the organization's procedures, and also it must not be in a silo where there is a food defense plan but it's not integrated with your system and it's not supported by the organization's entire food safety management system. So it must be fully integrated. And if you look at, for example, at the context of the organization, you look at the risk and opportunities. If your food defense threats are a big risk, the expectation would be for you to look at that, look at food defense under that clause as well, and make sure that the mitigation measures that you have looked at your food defense plan are incorporated also under your risk and opportunities where you can improve. Again, when you look at the ISO 22000 clause 10, continual improvement, if there has been any area of concern in your food defense plan, the expectation is that as part of your continual improvement, you do take into account the food defense plan and see how is it that you can improve the plan and the implementation thereof within the organization, taking into account the risk that you would have identified. Right, I just wanted to quickly go through the different documents that we have on our toolkit, FSSC 22000 version 6 toolkit. We do have a procedure. The procedure explains everything that is in here, how it's applied, what is it that you have considered, what is it that you are going to do to ensure that the facility is protected from threats and also from aggressors. It also defines a methodology that we are using to do our food defense risk assessment. You'll see that under this Excel file as well, the risk assessment, under tab 2, we have also further elaborated what is it that you have considered and how is it that we are going to ensure that this food defense plan is properly applied. So that is our methodology. Other people would use perhaps the FDA food defense plan methodology. That is perfectly fine. You do just need to define it as per the requirements of FSSC 22000. Then we have got a variety of forms that one could use. We have a visitor's questionnaire, visitors entry report form, the gate pass form, especially for deliveries after they have been inspected for possible threats that they could bring into the facility. Then we have got the food defense checklist that specifically focuses on the process flow and look at the variety, the various points of where there could be vulnerabilities or threats. Then the annual security assessment checklist, where we are looking at what are the security measures that we have as a facility that can protect against potential threats such as professional criminals, theft, or any other threats that could be posed through by security breaches or through security breaches. So this is what we would have. Let me just show you, maybe open one to give you an idea how this document actually looks, so that you can try to make sure that maybe you yourself you formulate a document that would look at least similar. What we have done, we have ensured that it covers all the requirements of the standard, obviously bearing in mind that we do need to comply with FSSC 20,000 requirements. So we have ensured that each and every aspect of this procedure takes into account the different requirements of the standard, obviously. Right, so let me show you the example. Let's see, here it is. So this is our procedure. So it looks at, of course, the basic structure of compiling the procedure, the responsibilities, the action method, how we're going to do it, the food defense vulnerability assessment that we are doing. We're saying that we're going to do it annually, the access control, how we're going to do it, and then specifying the different measures that we implement to ensure assessment control. Then the visitors, what is expected of them, the reporting, and also the most important thing is the transport breakdown, what will happen in such a scenario. Then in our food defense risk assessment, we have ensured that we explain the actual practical application of our plan. So these are our food defense risks that could occur, and how is it that as a facility we are going to apply this methodology. So we want to ensure that if an auditor asks, how are you conducting this food defense? What is the methodology that you are using? We can actually show them this tab and say, based on this method, this is how we have done the threat assessment. This is how we look at the risk register. This is how we have identified the sensitive areas as a facility. So this is just gives you a clear idea how you can consolidate your documents or compile your document to meet the requirements of FSSC 22,000. Remember, you still have to do the training for staff on food defense and site security, and the food defense team must be familiar with the concept of food defense, the principles of food defense, and the methodology that you as a site are using for your food defense. Right, so 2.5.32 C talks about the plan having to comply with applicable legislation, cover the processes and products within the scope of the organization, and be kept up to date. So basically, this is self-explanatory. If you have got any legislation that speaks to food defense and site security requirements for your industry, you make sure that you incorporate those requirements in your system. You also must ensure that the processes that the product goes through from receiving right until it gets to maybe it gets loaded into the container or the truck. And if that is part of the scope of certification, you make sure that you look at all those process steps and all the products that will be mentioned in the scope of your certification. You also are expected to ensure that you keep it up to date whenever there has been changes in your processes. Perhaps you have also installed another line, or there is an additional process step that you have implemented, the additional products that you have introduced. The expectation would be that your food defense plan would have taken that into account as well, or you review your food defense plan and incorporate the new changes that the organization would then have implemented. Let's look at the examples of food defense legislation. Not many countries actually do have this food defense legislation. There are some countries, like for example the US and also the EU bloc, that has introduced legislation specifically addressing the food defense. So the US have what they call the Food Safety Modernization Act, that emphasizes preventive measures to ensure food safety, which also has provisions of food defense, where it looks at what are the measures that organizations in the food supply chain would need to implement to protect against intentional contamination. There is also the Bioterrorism Act of 2002, which is a U.S. legislation requiring food facilities to register with the FDA and implement measures to protect food from terrorism and other acts of sabotage. Then in the EU, we have got the EU Food Law Regulation number 178 of 2002 that lays down the general principles and requirements of food law in the EU, which then also makes provisions for food defense. So those are maybe the examples that I can mention now, but depending on the country, where you are exporting, you must ensure that you are familiar with what is it that they require you to implement. There could be countries that don't have, that is fine, but make sure that you check with your agent or a broker or whoever that would be where you will be selling the product to make sure that you have incorporated that country's legislation. Some countries like South Africa at this point, as in 2024, we don't necessarily have any legislation that speaks directly to food defense. So if you don't have, you would normally just follow the standard requirements, but then if there is, ensure that that is incorporated into your food safety management system. Right, now we are going to look at the requirements for food chain category F2 that discusses brokering, trading, and e-commerce. 2.5.3.2 D requires that all food chain category F2 organizations must make sure that in addition to the requirement of C, B, and A, the organization ensures that their suppliers have a food defense plan in place. So if you are a broker, you're a trader, or you're in e-commerce, you must ensure that your suppliers that are supplying you with the product, they have put in place a food defense plan in place. So you would want to make sure that throughout the supply chain, as you sell the product to the consignee, to the end consumer, there is some form of guarantee that the organization that has supplied you with that product, they've done everything they could to protect that product from possible contamination. Right, so let's discuss the frequently asked questions. The first one is, do you need a threat assessment team? The short answer is no, but it is advisable for you to have a food defense or a threat assessment team where you incorporate all the relevant parties, especially security, production, quality, maybe marketing, and whoever is maybe logistics as well, since they're involved in the supply chain. This ensures that you get the input from all the relevant people who would then contribute to ensuring that your food is protected throughout the supply chain from receiving right until it is delivered to the customer. Generally, the practice would be to also incorporate the HACCP team as part of the threat assessment team. So it is advisable to have one, but according to the standard, there is no explicit requirement under 2.5.3 that stipulates that there must be a threat assessment team. The second question is, who needs food defense training? So the most important, I think the starting point will be the threat assessment team or the food defense team, who need to understand what food defense is, what are the principles of food defense, what are the different methodologies that one would use or could use to implement a food defense system. After you have done that, you need to ensure that your staff is aware of the food defense practices that the organization has, and also what is it that they should look out for to ensure that your food is protected from threats that you would have identified. So I would say that the more in-depth training, you'd offer it to the food defense team, and then the awareness training would be offered to staff members. Does FSSC 22000 provide guidance regarding food defense? Yes, definitely. If you go to the FSSC 22000 website, they've provided guidance documents there, and one of those guidance documents is the food defense guidance document. So you could go there and check it out. Then the last question from people would be, is food defense the same as site security? Are these the same, or is this the same terminology? When I speak about food defense, is it the same as site security? The short answer is no. Food defense focuses on protecting food products from intentional contamination or tampering, ensuring the safety throughout the food chain. It involves implementing measures to prevent malicious acts that could harm consumers or disrupt food safety. On the other hand, site security focuses on the overall protection of a facility or location, including physical security measures, surveillance, and access control to safeguard against various threats, including theft, vandalism, or unauthorized access. So you could say that part of the aspect of food defense would be site security, but it's not, or these two terms cannot be used interchangeably. These are two different terms. From the round of audits, there are a few things that I think one should be aware of. The first thing is making sure that your threat assessment has a defined methodology, or is based on a defined methodology, and it makes sense how you identified the potential threats. It's also important that you look at all the processes that you have. For example, if you have got 3 different warehouses or 3 different production facilities that are part of the scope, make sure that you fully incorporate those 3 different facilities, because each one of those facilities may pose a different risk profile in terms of food defense. So that's one of the things that we notice, that some organizations do not incorporate all the different sites. And make sure that all the products, obviously if it's 3 different facilities, that means that highly likely that there are 3 different products that are manufactured, or group of products that are manufactured. Ensure that you incorporate all of them as per the requirement of the standard. And if you have identified the significant threats, you have seen that this is a high risk threat, make sure that the mitigation measures show that you have brought the threat to a form of control, so under control one way or the other. Because if you leave it open, the assumption is that there isn't any mitigation measure that you have put in place to mitigate against the threats that you would have identified. If you are exporting to countries where there is legislation, for example, in the US and also the EU bloc, ensure that you incorporate their requirements as part of your food defense system, because if you have not incorporated, of course, you have not really then complied with the standard under 2.5.3.2. Then for agents and brokers, what we have seen is that they do not really stipulate the requirement for their suppliers to have a food defense plan in place. There isn't any evidence that they provided during the audit that shows that they have one or the other checked that their suppliers have a food defense plan in place. And remember that it does not stipulate what type of suppliers that you would inquire about the food defense plan. It just says suppliers. So the assumption is whoever is then your supplier, the responsibility would be for you as a broker or an agent or a business that is in e-commerce to double check and ensure that there is a system that you have put in place to check if your suppliers do in fact have a food defense plan in place. The other thing or another audit finding that is most common is not reviewing your your food defense plan whenever there are changes, which makes it irrelevant for that facility at that time. So if you have added perhaps a line, you have added another facility, you have modified your site, the expectation would be for you to then review a food defense plan to determine whether it's still applicable, because the controls that you would have proposed would surely then perhaps change due to the changes that you have made as a site. If perhaps you hire a new security company, or that would also be and have an impact on your risk profile. Looking at another thing would be the CCTV, for example. If you have based your controls on CCTVs, is there a person that actually monitors those CCTVs? Do you have an idea where they are located throughout the facility? And if then your control is a CCTV and you find that for 3 months it was not working, what then do we do? What is then the control for that aspect where you were focusing solely on CCTVs as your form of control? If it doesn't work, how does that affect your food defense plan? So I would say that those were the most popular findings from this round of audits, and I would urge you to please pay attention to that.